I would like to talk about two challenges that face the industry today and two challenges that face the government today. I'll try and be as brief so that you can be liberated from this as early as possible. The 21st century is indeed something which has been a very disruptive kind of a period, particularly for industry, for the society as a whole. In fact, the very fact that I am rejoicing, even if it is a small audience, high quality audience, the fact that I'm rejoicing looking at real people in front of me rather than talking to images in a plastic screen, it proves the fact that what was considered unusual is becoming usual. You know, the Black Swan event, as we have talked about, Black Swan is something which was considered in the Latin literature as something completely impossible because swans are only white and they can never be black swans. Until a Dutch explorer went to Australia and found actually black swans. So unusual becomes the usual, the impossible becomes the possible. And therefore, we have seen in the last few years with COVID, the intensity of which was never forecast, completely disrupting life. And unfortunately, this is not going to be the last pandemic in the century. This is not going to be the last disruptive event. We've got the specter of Ukraine-Soviet war, which we don't know what kind of disruptions that this is going to bring about. There was this person called Donald Rumsfeld. He used to be the Secretary of Defense in the Bush government and particularly known for the rather infamous Iraq war, which he planned. But despite all his failures, he made some remarkably good statement. And one of the statements that he made in front of the Congress is to say that I can only plan and insure against the known risks and the known unknown risks. But I can't do much about the unknown known risks and the unknown risks. The 21st century is going to really be full of unknown known risks, or worse still, unknown risks. And there is nothing that we can do about it. So that's one thing that the industry has to really face. And this is a 21st century phenomenon. There used to be a word called VUCA, V-U-C-A. It's an acronym which stood for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This was coined again by the US military sometime in the 1980s to talk about a world that is going to be completely unpredictable, completely uncertain, and therefore they were looking at what kind of mechanisms do we need to face the kind of challenges of a world which is unpredictable and uncertain. And VUCA used to be the kind of subject that was discussed in conferences such as these, management conferences. But now we are really in the VUCA world. We are in a world where we have events, Black Swan events happening with the ferocity which was unprecedented, with a very unpredictable kind of impact. And therefore, that is the one big challenge that industry and economic activity will be facing in the coming decades. What do we do about that? I think the only thing that we can do about that is to make the organization very agile. Industry has to get very, very agile. Something happens, then you've got to be not flat-footed. You've got to think smartly and make sure that the organization responds very quickly. That's the agility of the organization. Organizations tend to get flat-footed for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because it's asset-heavy. An asset-heavy organization cannot turn around as fast as an asset-light organization. It could be very, very hierarchy-bound organization, legacy organizations living for several decades, and therefore very difficult to make changes in the hierarchy, to respond to changes, respond to disruptive changes, and therefore the only thing that we really need in industry to look for is how to become more agile to face unknown known risks or unknown risks. There's a second challenge, and that second challenge is about what might seemingly look like a very inverted sense of value. I've written about both these in the article that you wanted me to give. I happened to be thinking about it a couple of weeks ago when I was giving a talk to a different forum, and that's when this came up as a thought, and I thought I'll share this. If you just look at the kind of value that is getting created and ask yourself the question, what is the most valuable link that the market thinks is valuable in a chain? Take, for example, the food to fork chain. You've got the farmer who toils on the land, is dependent on monsoons and is dependent on a variety of things to work his way, is faced with a great deal of challenges, grows crops over a period of time, risks of pests, all kinds of things. Is that the most valuable link in the chain from farm to fork? Or is it the wholesale trade at the mandi, which takes these farm produce and distributes to different parts of the country or to the world? Is that the most valuable part? Or is it a restaurant that procures a variety of things and then has the best chef in the world to create the cuisine that you most enjoy? Is that the most valuable link in the chain? Or is it the guy who distributes the pizza to your doorstep? Which is the most valuable chain? The market is saying the most valuable chain in the farm to fork is the delivery boy, with the delivery of pizza. Now that looks very perverse. There's no way that a farmer can go to the market and raise through an IPO his capital. There's no way that a trader can go to market and raise capital through an IPO. But a delivery technology platform like a Swiggy can raise. Now, is that a very inverted, perverse way of doing value marking? The answer is no. The answer is that if you stop and think, this is the link which empowers the customer most. It empowers you in a manner that we had never dreamt of in the past. It empowers you to order pizza from Domino's. It empowers you to take garlic bread from somewhere else, and then it empowers you to take chai from Chai King and get the delivery at the time that you want. And you can even say, which is the delivery boy that you think would, the highly rated boy that you has to deliver. It empowers in a way that had never been thought about. The higher the customer empowerment, the greater is the value. That's the message. The more the customer is able to configure a solution for himself or herself, that's the most valuable piece. That's the new challenge that we have. Therefore, is it possible that every link in the chain to be able to deploy technology or find solutions in a manner where we can empower the customer in a way that we had never imagined, the customer had never imagined. Now, the ultimate customer empowerment is not to pay for anything. I mean, whatever service you get, and if you're not paying for it, that's ultimate customer empowerment. And clearly that's the way that you get customer addiction in a Google or Facebook, because you don't pay for it, because that's your empowerment, right? But then it's often said that if you don't pay for something, then you are the product. So, but the message is clear that it is the empowering of the customer that becomes most valuable, and every organization has to pivot itself to face this reality. That's the second challenge. I want to come to the two challenges which I think the state in general, the governments, national governments, the world in general face. Unlike the industry challenges, which are 21st century challenges, the challenges being faced by the government are 19th century problems. But I'm afraid they are coming to a tipping point now, and that's the reason why this is getting to be a critical thing. The first challenge is that until now, no economist has been able to figure out a way to grow without exacerbating inequality. This is the fundamental question that has been a major challenge for 2 centuries. Back in the 19th century, when we had this concept of socialism taking roots, which had been in the making for another century prior to that, after the French Revolution, it's almost a century and a half, and it took roots to say, it is important to address the issue of inequality. You can't have the rich noble on the one side and the poor peasantry on the other side and then talk about equality and fraternity. You cannot have equality in fraternity if there is going to be such deep divisions, if there's going to be such huge differences in the economic position of the people. And therefore, socialism came into being, it took its root. And then we had the Karl Marx and the others who followed. Socialism put in the center of the stage the fact that we need to have less inequality, people with almost similar kind of economic power, maybe commensurate with the skills they have. And that's the ideal society. And then we had the Soviet Russia model, and then you had the Chinese model, and all of them getting inspired by a variety of academicians who espouse this cause of socialism and inequality and equality. And then we saw the spectacular failure of Soviet group. And it later came into the academic discussions that what you really ended up doing is not distributing the wealth, but distributing poverty. Because in the part of the socialism, all of us who have read Ayn Rand and so on, fired up by the concept of individual freedom and the ability, therefore, to create your own value, were all influenced by this and said that no, distribution of poverty is the end result of socialism, which has been in practice, and we have seen this spectacular failure all around. Therefore, a free market situation, and then you had the Reagan, you had the Margaret Thatcher, and you had a series of others, including China, which embraced capitalism under the veneer of political communism. And then you had this free market theories, and we had another century almost now of free run of the free market ideology. And I believe that that is now coming into question. And the reason is that there is vast inequality in the world. There's vast inequality in India. I think the Oxfam report talked about the top 1% of India's population controlling or possessing 77% of the total wealth of the country, and the bottom 50% having just 1%. You had another report which talked about the fact that the top 10% had almost 96 times the income of the bottom 50%. That's the inequality. And we are not alone. Almost every country is facing this inequality, including the US. But in a relatively richer country to have inequality, when the basic needs of the people have been met, it's easier to manage. If you've got a non-democratic country, such as some in the Middle East and some others in Latin America, when you have inequality, it's easier to manage. The more difficult challenge is when you're a democracy and you've given the voice to the people and have an inequality to tackle, that then becomes the big challenge. Now, I'm not saying that something is going to collapse tomorrow on Monday morning, but I think we are reaching a tipping point. And when you reach a tipping point of this, this is not about the tipping point as you would have in a small incident which changes immediately. It's about an avalanche. It takes time, right? But the tipping point happens. It's about the rumblings underneath which result in a massive earthquake sometimes. Those rumblings are there. Those rumblings will come in a big force in a democratic country. And the next decade, that's going to be the challenge for us. What do we do with that? I think we need to address the growth with equality in a way which I think is a very cornerstone of the political ideology of this government, which is about social justice. Social justice and getting equal access and opportunities for education and health is an important consideration. And that goes to reduce the inequality. So that's the first challenge. And I think Tamil Nadu, in that sense, has got in a better platform to manage this because of the emphasis that it has always had, that this political ideology has always had in social justice, which really means that you are addressing the needs of those who are unable to participate in the market and therefore need to be given the access to education and health and competitive skills in order to be able to compete in the market. The second issue, somewhat related to the first challenge, and the second challenge for the government is the fact that you've got a limited kind of distribution capability. If you take the GDP of the country, it's about 3 trillion, and the budget for the expenditure budget of national government is $500 billion. So you've got a 2.5 trillion, which has a trickle effect going down to the bottom. You create jobs and you make the wealth flow down because you're using services. That's a trickle effect. And the trickle is pretty often a very small trickle, right, and takes time. What you can do as a government is to take taxes and then distribute this by way of a free gas or free housing and so on and so forth. But how much can you do? You're doing $500 billion out of a 3 trillion. And within $500 billion, 40% is the welfare, right? That's about all the needle that you can make, the change that you can make. So is this something that you can do in order to address the needs of those who can't participate in the market? Therefore, do we pump more into welfare schemes, or do we invest in capital in areas where there is a multiplier effect and it creates jobs, and therefore the trickle down happens at the subsequent stage? That's a dilemma that every government faces. You know, how do you balance between the welfare and the investments that you do? How do you balance between an expenditure now, expenditure for the current revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure? How do you take the multiplier effect and wait for that to happen while you've got somebody knocking at the door for immediate dose? That's the second challenge. Why is it such an important challenge? Because I believe that we are again getting into a tipping point in terms of what we can do in terms of welfare and the amount of money that we are setting aside for capital expenditure. That capital expenditure that is being set aside, which is considerable now in the last few years, if that can trigger the private investments to happen, which has not yet happened, then the virtuous cycle starts. If it fails to do that, and it fails to do that because the market size is not large enough, and therefore there's not large enough demand, and if it fails to do that, then you've got a tipping point happening there, because you can't carry on with this proportion for long. Now, how do they all stack up? They all stack up, because industry cannot look at agility unless there is an economic stability. If the economic situation is fickle, if it is not strong enough, then you can't have at an individual industry level or an enterprise level, you cannot be agile. So the two are linked. A resilient economy can afford an enterprise to become also agile. But a non-resilient economy, which is fickle, is exposed to risks, and it will flow down to at enterprise level. Similarly, you cannot have customer empowerment, and this is something which I say with some years of experience of having run different companies in different industries. You cannot have this customer empowerment going beyond the point unless you have the scale. The reason why you have some of the technology platforms giving you this empowerment is because it's wafer thin margin, but the scale is very, very large. And when do you have the market to be very large? Only when you don't have inequality, when people can participate in the market with their own purchasing power and not dependent on the doles. So they are interlinked. And this is the circuit of challenges that industry and the government together face in this coming decades. They are not without solutions, but these are hard solutions. And this is not without the possibility that you could slip on the solutions. But there is no option but to move on the path for solving these challenges, because it should not be too late for us to make that happen. Thank you very much.